This is a party politics edition of Truth, Politics, and Power. I'm Neal Conan. In March, President Trump visited Andrew Jackson's plantation to embrace another disruptive populist as a presidential role model.
Jackson's victory shook the establishment like an earthquake. Henry Clay, Secretary of State for the defeated President John Quincy Adams, called Jackson's victory mortifying and sickening. Oh boy, does this sound familiar. Have we heard this?
How our political parties evolved from the age of Jackson to the politics of obstruction that led up to the election of Donald Trump. It's Truth, Politics, and Power. This is a party politics edition of Truth, Politics, and Power. I'm Neal Conan. After his inauguration, Donald Trump placed a portrait of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office, and in March he traveled to Tennessee to visit Jackson's grave on what would have been the 250th birthday of our seventh president. President Trump's affection for Jackson tells us a great deal about the kind of politician he hopes to be. Last November, Chief Strategist Steve Bannon told The Hollywood Reporter, "Like Jackson's populism, we're going to build an entirely new political movement. The conservatives," Bannon added, "are going to go crazy." The movement Jackson built was disruptive, anti-elitist, and reveled in some of the most partisan political attacks in American history. President Trump is apparently willing to overlook the fact that that movement was called the Democratic Party, and we heard little mention of the slaves who worked the plantation where President Jackson is buried, or his infamous Indian Removal Act that led to the Trail of Tears. With both parties now deeply divided against themselves as well as each other, what can the history of party politics tell us about their future and even about the possibility of a new realignment? Later in the program, we'll talk with Democratic strategist and pollster Cornell Belcher about the tectonic transformations that began in the 1960s, and with scholars Thomas Mann and Norm Ornstein about dysfunction, obstruction, and filibuster. But we begin with Heather Cox Richardson, who teaches 19th century American history at Boston College and wrote a history of the Republican Party to make men free. She joins us from her office in Boston. Thanks very much.
It's nice to be here.
Do you see parallels between Presidents Trump and Jackson?
Well, yes, I do, but I don't think that we should be too overt about them. They're certainly there, but there are other things, of course, going on with the Trump presidency, and the Jackson presidency looked very different in some ways than the Trump presidency does. I think what Trump grabs hold of, though, when he is admiring of Andrew Jackson is that Jackson sold himself as an outsider, as somebody who was going to take on Washington, take on the corrupt administration, take on this bloated bureaucracy that was hurting the little guy. But what's interesting to me about that is that image of the outsider, as you say, overrides the concept that Jackson was, in fact, a wealthy slave owner. And the policies that he put in place that he said were going to help the little guy, in fact, helped to crash the economy. What he was really trying to do was to reinforce a society in which a few wealthy slave owners really ran everything. And that sort of duality of I'm a populist, but I'm really going to build the swamp rather than drain it is one that is probably casting a little bit more reflection on President Trump than he intended.
Why did Andrew Jackson and his political allies need to establish or want to establish a new political party?
Well, there was a sense among Americans in the early republic, the era of Andrew Jackson, that the administration, the government had been taken over by wealthy Eastern businessmen and bankers, for the most part, who were using the government for their own ends. And they argued that that was not what American government was truly supposed to be. People like Jackson promised to drain the swamp, if you will, although he didn't use that language. But there was something hidden in that, and that was not simply that they wanted to return the government to the little guy, although that's what they talked about. What they wanted to make sure of was that the slave owners in Jackson's case, the Southern entrepreneurs, the Southern white men who owned large plantations and huge numbers of slaves, had an equal shot at the federal government. And what they did was they organized the Democratic Party in part by pulling together a coalition of regular guys on the frontier, if you will, who resented the government, but also the wealthy slave owners who resented the northern government, the Easterners who seemed to be operating the government in such a way that it was benefiting them and not the slave system. So it was a duality that actually looks in many ways like what we've got going on today. But what was interesting about that moment was that the Democratic Party therefore took it into its very DNA that the country was designed in such a way that there were haves and have-nots, that the world was really divided in two between people with power and people without power, and that it was kind of a zero-sum game. The pie was only so large, and that the Democratic Party had to stand on the side of the people who were outside of power. They had to put their finger on the scale so that people at the bottom ended up with a level playing field against the more powerful and wealthier people on the other side. The Republican Party, on the other hand, rose a great deal later in a different kind of environment and at a different time, and it developed a very different sort of DNA. And America needs both of those parties, I think, to maintain the balance that it has managed to hold together since the 1850s.
We'll get to the establishment of the Republican Party in just a couple of minutes, but I wanted you to talk about what you've described as a cycle in American politics between extremism and moderation. And as Andrew Jackson is elected, we're in the extremist end, right?
Yes, but Jackson had no monopoly on that. Yes, he was a hard-spoken Western, Southwesterner. He was perhaps a man who believed that he knew better than anybody else and disdained learning and disdained the idea that anybody might have something to contribute. In that, he was perhaps extremist, but in his ability to use that kind of a personality to change the course of American history or of world history, he was bound by the era in which he lived.
All right, let's move ahead and to much more about the fight over slavery and the run-up to the Civil War, which saw the collapse of the Whigs and the birth of the other enduring American political party. You also argue that the Republicans were engaged in a dispute over another modern-sounding issue, economic equality.
I would argue that the story of America has always been the story of a fundamental human tension and a fundamental American tension. And that is, on the one hand, the principles enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, the idea that everybody, of course they limited it to men at the time, but that is a principle that showed capacity for extraordinary expansion, the idea that everybody has a right to equality of opportunity, not to equality of outcome necessarily, but to equality of opportunity. That's a statement of principles that we put in our Declaration of Independence in 1776 to try and justify the idea that this was a good enough reason to throw off British rule. That's very different than the fundamental body of laws on which this country rests, and that, of course, is the Constitution. What's central to the Constitution is that it protects property. It holds people secure in their property rights. And the problem with having those two things yoked together is that you really can't have equality of opportunity without putting some limits on the right of people to accumulate property. That is, at some point, if you're going to protect equality of opportunity, you have to say to the very few people who are accumulating wealth and power in a community, wait. You have to pay your workers a basic wage, or wait, you can't pollute our rivers, or wait a minute, you need to put some money toward the roads and the schools. And that is fundamentally an infringement on the pure right to accumulate property. We've really kind of swung between those two poles since that time, and it's a swing that we really have never quite managed to slow down, with the possible exception of the years after World War II, the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s, when most Americans shared what came to be called the liberal consensus, the idea that the government could stop the swing between these two poles by having an activist state.
Well, you've taken us back to our founding fathers. George Washington, of course, famously hated what he called faction, what we would call political parties. How much of our tension that you described can be traced back to two of Washington's principal aides, his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton? What were their differences and how have they played out?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. You know, Hamilton's getting a lot of attention now because of the musical, and it's about time. One of the things Hamilton managed to do was he managed to recognize the principle that you cannot start and succeed as a country unless you have people with money on your side. And he managed to fund the government in such a way that he made the interests of people with wealth dependent on the interests of the country. Regardless of how you feel about class issues in America, that was a stroke of genius, because you can't make a country survive if the people who have money aren't on the side of your country, and he's the one who managed to do that. But of course, what that meant was that it brought men of wealth and power to the support of the government, but it also meant that the government had, in part, to act for the interests of men with wealth and power. Now, there is that sort of Eastern bankers, traders, industrial vision of the country. But then there is also the vision of the country that was embraced by Jefferson. And make no mistake, Jefferson was no populist. Like Jackson after him, although they were different in many ways, of course, Jefferson talked about the yeoman farmer, about how people belonged on the land, about how the real heart of American society was the individual farmer. But let's not forget that Jefferson was a large slave owner, and his interests might have been colored by that ideology of every man should work the land. The reality was his version of working the land was having enslaved people do it for him. So what he was really interested in was less the idea of returning government to regular people on the street, if you will, but rather making sure that slave owners had as much of a say in the government as Eastern bankers and Eastern seamen and traders. But you always have to overlay that with the reality that the early 19th century already had a very limited vision of who should participate in the American government. And it did not include the majority of us. It struck out women, it struck out people of color, it struck out poor people, and it struck out uneducated people. So there were already limits to those two visions. We've expanded them, of course. We've read more into them. But these two were not, except in a very limited sense, the precursors of a major struggle between the people and the establishment. They were basically looking at different kinds of an establishment.
You've written a history of the Republican Party. Where do you think that party, your specialty is, of course, 19th century politics, but where do you think that party stands today?
Where it stands today is it is an extreme that it has never been at before. But it's also a fascinating moment because we are experiencing a very new thing in American history, and that is, of course, the interference of another country on our electoral process. I look at the present, and I look at it very much like the 1890s. And that was in the 1890s. It looked like the Republican Party had taken the country to an extreme of protecting big business. It was gutting any kind of legislation that seemed like it would help people at the bottom, workers, miners, people and immigrants, people in the cities. Many of the same policies that we embrace today, they embraced in the 1890s and the early 1900s. But within those moments, or within the 1890s, there was already the rise within the party of a significant number of people who said, wait a minute, this is not the party I signed up for. I signed up for the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln, the Republican Party that is going to become the Progressive Party of Teddy Roosevelt, the idea that the government really should be promoting equality of opportunity by making it possible for people at the bottom to rise to prosperity. And within the Republican Party, even at a moment when it looked extraordinarily far right in the 1890s, were already the seeds of the progressive movement in the form of people like Henry Cabot Lodge, like Fighting Bob La Follette, like Teddy Roosevelt. You couldn't see them in those early years, but they were there, they were making friends, they were rethinking their positions, and they were ready to burst into prominence in the 1890s, which is precisely what they did. And I think that's what's going to happen. I think you could see it happening right now as the party is in such turmoil and as people on the street seem to be taking the public sphere back into their own hands again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Heather Cox Richardson teaches 19th century American history at Boston College. She's the author of To Make Men Free, A History of the Republican Party. Coming up, both political parties redefine themselves in the cauldron of the 1960s. Stay with us. I'm Neal Conan. It's Truth, Politics, and Power. This is Truth, Politics, and Power. I'm Neal Conan. Slavery lay at the heart of 19th century politics in America. 100 years later, race would still be the most important factor in the seismic realignment that shaped the Republican and Democratic parties as we know them today. Later in this program, we'll talk with scholars Norm Ornstein and Thomas Mann about the politics of obstruction and the futures of two fractured parties. But first to the pivotal year of 1964. Amid the fervor of the civil rights movement, President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. There's a story that he turned to aid Bill Moyers as he did so and remarked, "We have lost the South for a generation." Whether he said that or not, he was right. Starting with Richard Nixon in 1968, Republicans would win 7 of the next 10 presidential elections, interrupted by 2 Southern Democrats, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. By the time Republican George W. Bush was elected for the first of his 2 terms, what had been once the solid Democratic South had completed the long transition to the solid Republican South, while the Northeast and the West Coast states turned ever more blue. As a longtime Democratic Party strategist, Cornell Belcher lived that realignment. He was a pollster in both of Barack Obama's presidential campaigns. He's now president of Brilliant Corners Research and Strategies and joins us from his office in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm honored to be on.
Old people like me would argue that 1964 was not really all that long ago, but the Civil Rights Act passed the Senate with the considerable aid of liberal and moderate Republicans and over the bitter objections of conservative Southern Democrats. Some 50 years later, both those species are nearly extinct.
Well, it really was a pivotal moment when Johnson signed it. And as a Southerner, Johnson understood the implications. Truth of the matter is, Democrats haven't lost the South for a generation. What Lyndon Johnson really could have said is Democrats have lost the white vote for the next several decades. Because if you look at it, a Democrat has not won a majority or even won the white vote since Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act and thus realigned the parties. And, you talked about, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. Jimmy Carter won, right on the back end of Watergate when the Republican brand was at its historical low, right? And he still only garnered 46% of the white vote.
As more and more Democrats embraced civil rights, though, Republicans clearly saw an opportunity. Did that begin in 1968 with Richard Nixon's Southern strategy?
Well, absolutely it did. Race trumps almost every other variable historically. And Du Bois talked about this in Black Reconstruction, right? Where after the Civil War, in many ways, the poor whites were just as worse off as the freed slave, but the plantation owners and the white establishment gave poor whites Jim Crow to eat, and they ate till they're full, right? And I think you see the same sort of thing happening right now. I mean, there's not been a progressive political movement, particularly in the South, where you could argue there should be when you look at sort of the economic realities of poor whites and poor blacks, because, quite frankly, the racial wedge there. In the South in particular, I would argue that race is your class. No matter how rich or poor you are, if you're black, you're still the N-word, and no matter how rich or poor you are, if you're white, you were still white, and you were better than the black people. Race has historically been your class in the South.
In the latter part of the 20th century, both parties underwent structural reforms as well. We look at the schedule of party primaries and caucuses every 4 years as if it was somehow written in stone. How and when did that change come about?
And I'm speaking from the Democrat side, and I was also pollster for Chairman Dean at the DNC. The demographics, really, when you did have states like South Carolina and Nevada being moved up because we needed, there was a demand for more representative, more states where you had an electorate that looked increasingly like the diversity of America. And that's nothing to knock against Iowa or New Hampshire. I love New Hampshire. But there was a call and a cry that, these early states often are pivotal, right? I mean, sometimes the primary is almost decided in the first 2 states. So there was a cry that you need a more diverse electorate.
What was it, though, that convinced the party establishment to give up so much of the power that it had, well, as late as 68 for sure, in determining the candidate of the party and turn it over to the much more democratic process of primaries and the somewhat less democratic process of caucuses?
I think the people, right? And this is the good thing about our American system, right? When the people raise up and voice their opinions strongly enough and act upon it, things do change, right? We have a whole history of change in this country because people rose up and said and demanded that it changed. And I think what you saw with the primary process, you saw Americans not wanting this to be a backroom deal by rich and powerful people, but in fact put it in the hands of the American people and let them decide.
Did Ronald Reagan's election in 1980, it seems like an important transformational shift from this point. To what degree did Ronald Reagan's election in 1980 shift the Republican Party to the right?
Well, I don't know how greatly it shifted the Republican Party to the right, but I think you also see elements of race matters there. I mean, look at where Ronald Reagan kicked his campaign off, right, in Philadelphia, Mississippi. So, I mean, in the historical context of what happened there, and this whole argument about states' rights, sort of ground central there. I mean, I think that was, in fact, a play on the Southern strategy, right? And then sort of the whole coded conversations, about welfare queens, right? I mean, that is all sort of doubling down of the Southern strategy. But I also understand that, demographics are beginning to sort of change and shift a little by little throughout the course of all these historical happenings, right? And you can't ignore what's happening demographically in the country and how that impacts and intensifies the racial cleavages in the country.
As we're tracing this long era of Republican dominance, it's certainly of presidential campaigns, do you see Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton as outliers? And Carter, of course, elected after the Watergate scandal, engulfed Richard Nixon, and Clinton won his first term in a three-way race against both independent Ross Perot as well as the first President Bush.
I think without Watergate, it's really hard to see how Jimmy Carter won. And I mean, even then, we talked about it. Look, a Democrat hasn't won the white vote since LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act, right? At the historical low point of the Republican brand, right after Watergate, Carter was only able to garner 46% of the white vote in his victory there, right? And then later on, didn't make reelect. And as brilliant as a campaigner and a political figure as Bill Clinton is, and again, you sort of whisper it because the Clinton people don't like this, but there's a pretty good argument out there that without Ross Perot in that race, Bill Clinton does not beat Daddy Bush, right? And only in his reelect did he in fact get to 46% of the white vote in his reelect. So there's been a real sort of cap of white voters breaking for Democrats, and that was not interrupted by the tremendous figure that Bill Clinton is. And again, Bill Clinton only got 46%.
At the time, Ross Perot was dismissed by many as sort of, a one-off oddity. In retrospect, should we have paid more attention?
I think the Republicans should have paid more attention to him. I mean, because the, fervor that he was generating with a certain group of white male voters there, and you could make the same sort of case about, Jesse Ventura later on in Minnesota, but the sort of rejection of the system and politics as usual on the right, particularly among white voters, the Republicans should have been paying more attention to it, because I think you can make an argument that he absolutely hurt Father Bush's chances for re-election. I think those voters who were breaking for Ross Perot, those white voters were not Democrat voters.
And they would be able to be picked up later by some Republican candidates. We're talking about the South as, first in the old Roosevelt coalition, the solid Democratic South, and then by the time George W. Bush is elected, the solid Republican South. There are other regional things going on as well, and an urban, suburban, rural divide.
Right. Well, and that urban, suburban, rural divide also coincides with white flight, right, and the browning of our urban areas, right? Again, you cannot dismiss demographic changes that are happening along this timeline also with the shifts in politics that you also see, with white flight and with the growth of the minority populations, you do get more of a wedge, and you see that played out in our politics, and particularly white flight out into the suburbs, where became very, very fertile ground for Republicans, whether it be in the Northeast or the South, quite frankly.
You mentioned earlier that you were part of Chairman Dean's team with the 50-state strategy. And you have to say 50-state strategy because at the time it looked like the Democratic Party was really uncompetitive in many states. And at various times, you could say the Republican Party is uncompetitive in certain states.
Well, I think the beauty of the 50-state strategy was in Governor Dean's deep-held belief that if we put our values first, we can compete anywhere, right? And one of the things that Governor Dean talked about was, half the job for Democrats is just showing up in these places. And for too often, we ceded the ground to Republicans, particularly in the deeply red South and the increasingly red Midwest. And you remember, the book "What's the Matter with Kansas," and what we come to find out, if Democrats actually put resources there and run good candidates there, and we put our values out there in competition with Republican values, we can in fact make inroads, because as we won actually in places like Kansas. And we went into 2006 saying that, if Republicans don't have a 30-point advantage around values and a 20-plus advantage around security, I think the elections are going to be very, very different. And you saw a wave election. Now, it did help that that George Bush was increasingly becoming very unpopular, and the whole Iraq war situation was unfolding in a way that was very helpful. But again, what Dean argued is if we put the resources there and we build the infrastructure, we'll have an opportunity to take advantage, in some of these red states, if the Republican brand did in fact slip, and it did in fact slip under George Bush.
And when you said the Iraq War was being helpful, I'm sure you meant tactically helpful for Democrats in an election. Obviously, the war was not going really well in many important ways. After all of this, you were part of the team that put together the Obama coalition. How much of that was the legacy of the 50-state strategy, and how much of it was a calculation, a strategy by the Obama team?
Well, a couple things. One is, the Obama campaign sort of picked up a couple things. One is this ideal, and our campaign manager, David Plouffe, said it going into 2008, that, we're not going to be sitting around on election night waiting for the results from just one state to come in order to determine the president, and we were not, right? This ideal that we're going to, spend resources, build infrastructure, and compete everywhere, right? And sort of expand the playing field, make Republicans compete in more places. And that's, in fact, what we did in 2008. The other piece of this is, one of the early conversations around, the table with then Senator Obama had to do with the idea of building a movement, right? And expanding the electorate and, making the electorate look back more like the American population, the changing face of Americans, right? President Obama in 2008 didn't win more of the white vote than John Kerry. I mean, there was a lot of conversation about sort of this huge breakthrough and racial breakthrough. John Kerry got 43% of the white vote and lost. Barack Obama got 43% of the white vote and won. And if you look at these battleground states, it wasn't like he blew through John Kerry's performance among white voters in these battleground states. No, he blew through the historic Democratic performance by, in fact, bringing in more young people and more people of color, right? Millennials are now, the most diverse generation of Americans in American history. And, realizing that demographic shift, helped Barack Obama, win in a way that Democrats typically have not been able to win. And then so you saw that in 2008, and in 2012, we got even less of the white vote there. And I talk about this in my book, how, quite frankly, over the space of that time, I thought racial aversion would decrease, and in fact it rose. And I think sort of some of that gave way to Trump. But in 2012, you had Barack Obama winning only 38% of the white vote. And I think, and this was a time where, look, for the first time in American history, you had the political supremacy of the white vote challenged in a way it has never been challenged before in history. And in fact, you have in Barack Obama, for the first time, the vast majority of white voters voting one way and the outcome of the election going another way. And this was a really sort of the wolf at the door. And then you had the rise of take back our country. And there was a real sense among certain Americans that, they are losing their country. And these demographic shifts that are happening are having them lose their country and lose power. And the Obama coalition challenged that white political historic supremacy where you can win back-to-back majorities with just 38% of the white vote because of the changing demographics, particularly in the battleground states.
During the Obama presidency, 8 years, of course he won re-election in 2012, Democrats consistently lost state legislatures, state senates, state governorships, eventually lost the House and the Senate. What happened?
There's two things. One is we should not confuse, presidential on-year elections with midterm elections because they're two different electorates. And in both cases, when President Obama was in fact on the ballot in the presidential election cycle and you had a younger, more diverse electorate, Democrats picked up Senate seats and Democrats picked up House seats, right? But they're different electorates. The midterm electorate, it wasn't like in 2010 voters said, "Oh my God, you know what? I made a complete mistake. That I didn't mean to do that," and then went out and voted the other way. No, they're different electorates. The midterm electorate is a far older, far less diverse, more conservative electorate. You have anywhere from 16 to 18% turnout difference between base Republican precincts and base Democratic precincts in off years. So regardless of what candidate, and this is the sort of conversation we've had in the party, right? If you look at 2014 and you look at 2010, if you look at those electorates, it's really hard for a Democrat to win. Right? You need an electorate that looks more like the presidential on-year electorate. You need an electorate that looks, in fact, younger and more diverse. And I think that has been a challenge for Democrats in the midterms when Obama was not on the ballot. And that's going to be the challenge for Democrats in this coming midterm, no matter how poorly Trump is situated in the polls right now. Democrats will not have a very good midterm election just because Trump's bad. They in fact need to generate the energy and motivate particularly younger people to come out and vote in midterms, which they have not been doing.
Cornell Belcher tells his story in a book, A Black Man in the White House. He was a pollster in both Obama campaigns. He's now president of Brilliant Corners Research and Strategies and joined us from his office in Washington, D.C. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
After a short break, are we on the cusp of another realignment? Thomas Mann and Norm Ornstein on the politics of obstruction and the future of our fractured political parties. I'm Neal Conan. This is Truth, Politics, and Power. This is Truth, Politics, and Power. I'm Neal Conan. In their most recent book, scholars Thomas Mann and Norm Ornstein offered some advice to journalists. Don't seek professional safety through the even-handed, unfiltered presentation of opposing views, they wrote. Which politician is telling the truth, they asked. Who is taking hostages at what risks and with what ends? The name of that book is It's Even Worse Than It Looks: How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism. It came out in 2012, and 5 years on, the title seems prescient. As we continue our look at political parties and the politics of faction, Thomas Mann and Norm Ornstein join us. Tom is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a resident scholar at UC Berkeley. He joins us from there. Welcome.
Happy to join you.
And Norm Ornstein, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and he joins us from a studio there in Washington, D.C. Nice to have you as well.
Great to be with you, Neal.
And I want to ask about both parties, how they've changed in the prospects of realignment. But I think we have to begin with Donald Trump and what some have described as his hostile takeover of the Republican Party. Norm Ornstein, how do we understand what happened last year?
I think we can understand it in a couple of ways, Neal. The first is that we've seen a dramatic increase since the fall of 2008 in what we could call angry populism. It did hit both parties, the Occupy Wall Street movement on the left side and the Tea Party movement on the right, but it brought with it a distaste for politics and politicians and elites that was even deeper. And that was, I think, itself dramatically increased by a conscious strategy on the part of Republican leaders in Congress when Barack Obama became president. Mitch McConnell and the so-called young guns in the House, Kevin McCarthy, Eric Cantor, and Paul Ryan, to try and block everything that he did, to make everything that Democrats managed to pass look illegitimate, and to make the entire governing process look bad. That meant that we had a Republican Party that was going to turn to an outsider, either a Donald Trump or a Ted Cruz type. They chose Trump. It was hostile in the sense that the elites didn't particularly want it. But I think what we could also say since the election is that the Stockholm Syndrome has taken over, and most Republicans in office have jumped on board the Trump train.
Tom, we'll get to that in just a minute, but I wanted to ask you, as Norm just said, much of the Republican establishment was either openly hostile to Donald Trump or at least kept a considerable distance. That included both Presidents Bush, the 2012 nominee Mitt Romney, the 2008 nominee John McCain. Why was the party establishment so weak?
Republicans in Congress simply made a decision that they would do business with him as a way of pushing their own agenda and overlook the illiberal actions of this very strange president. Now, ironically, Donald Trump, for the most part, has moved to embrace the Republican agenda, especially when it came to repeal and replace Obamacare and moving ahead toward tax reform and tax cuts. One can't see much light between Trump's agenda and the Republicans in Congress. So what seemed like a Faustian bargain is now seeing more of a blending of the two, although there are plenty of divisions within the Republican Party, especially in the House, that make governing complicated for them.
One thread through the campaign and now into the Trump presidency is his appeal to the alt-right, that group that includes white nationalists, and which is represented by Steve Bannon, the former head of Breitbart, who became Trump's campaign chair and after the election his chief strategist. In your 2012 book, you wrote about the politics of extremism. Did you consider Steve Bannon and Breitbart and the alt-right in that group as part of the Republican Party?
I don't think in 2012 the alt-right, which of course is a kind of sanitized name for a racist and anti-Semitic movement in a lot of ways, was a more significant factor. It is now. Breitbart was not far from a fairly traditional, radical, conservative rag out there, along with things like the Drudge Report, for example. It's changed in the last few years, and the movement has become much stronger. It was there at the time. It certainly became heightened as Barack Obama became president. It became a much more significant factor when Donald Trump took on the birther movement as his own. And now it's a clear feature of the contemporary Republican Party. But the Republican Party today is not what it used to be, either a center-right party or even a right-wing, traditionally conservative party. It's got a radical element to it, and within that radical element, there is this populist, darker side that's represented by Bannon and the alt-right. But it's not the only movement out there.
Tom, what do you think we learned about the Republican Party in the age of Trump from the failure of the health care bill?
We first of all learned that they are no longer a governing party, that they've played the game of political opposition so aggressively during the Obama years and took so many symbolic votes that they're nowhere close to being able to legislate, to pull together a serious proposals, say, on replacing the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. And so they find themselves frustrated as a consequence and unable to attract Democrats while having a Freedom Caucus that is pretty self-righteous in believing that nothing short of what they propose will entice them to support the proposals.
Norm Ornstein, you wrote a lot about strategic obstruction by Republicans during the Obama presidency, and we just saw a triumph for Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who, of course, refused to consider Merrick Garland, President Obama's Supreme Court nominee, and won his gamble in a tough year for Senate Republicans. He held on to his majority. A Republican nominee won the White House, and instead of Merrick Garland and a 5-4 majority for Democratic appointees on the Supreme Court, he got Neil Gorsuch and a 5-4 Republican majority. At what price?
Well, certainly it helps to blow up the norms that existed in the Senate. But I think the norms were gone long before this. And this change in the rules was more a reflection of a reality. Now, you can make a case that both parties have misused the filibuster for nominations and in other ways. But for the Democrats, it was the equivalent, I think, of jaywalking. And when we got the Gang of 14 compromise, after they'd held up some conservative appeals court judges, they let a number of them, including some very, very conservative ones, through several years ago. And then we saw a completely different level of obstruction of judges and of cabinet members and other executive appointees during the Obama years, and especially after his reelection. You look at the number of filibusters of judges during those years, they're greater than the entire previous period from the beginning of the Republic up until that time. And now the only question is whether there's anything remaining of norms in the institution to keep it from having the filibuster for legislative decisions changed as well. But that train left the station some time ago. And, you know, the Republican violations here were more on the felony level, not the jaywalking level.
Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore the extraordinary decision and execution by Mitch McConnell of denying President Obama's nomination to fill the vacancy after Justice Scalia died. There's a payoff for that kind of destructive behavior, and Gorsuch is now on the Supreme Court probably for at least 3 decades. And the court, when it comes to major issues, is increasingly predictable based on the party of the appointing president. So that was hardball to the extreme, and I think it will take many, many years for the wounds to heal, if ever.
Tom, you've described the radicalization of the Republican Party as it becomes much more of a parliamentary type party. Do you see the same thing happening to a Democratic Party that in 2012 you described as a pretty much a status quo party? They nominated a status quo candidate, Hillary Clinton. Of course, there was the Bernie Sanders insurgency as well. But do you see them shifting more and more ideologically to the left?
Certainly the Bernie Sanders candidacy stirred up a sort of left-wing sentiment within the country and within Republican ranks, especially younger people. The rhetoric of Sanders' campaign was really harshly anti-establishment. It was anti-big corporations. It was critical of Democrats for depending on the campaign financing from the financial services industry. So there was a left-wing populist critique. Hillary won the nomination and then lost the election in a shocker. I think the party, along with the country, has moved a bit left, certainly on social issues. The country has reconciled itself to the legitimacy of gay marriage, and in other respects, it seems to have done that. But if you look at the leadership of the Democratic Party, either Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi. These are liberals, but very operational liberals. And the Democratic Party is just not as ideological as the Republican Party. They're more inclined to try to do or serve the interests that are part of the Democratic coalitions. Minority groups play a very important part of that. So do labor unions, environmentalists, and college-educated professionals. Finally, the youngest cohort. So, yes, they want a public option attached to Obamacare so they can fill in states where there's at most one private insurer now available to offer policies. This is not radical stuff. I mean, the Republicans are looking to undo at least 50 years, more like 100 years of social and economic policy, environmental policy as well, going back to Republican President Teddy Roosevelt. And now it's become really quite aggressive, very different from the role Republicans played under Dwight Eisenhower and really in the 60s and 70s when Republican legislators were giants of the Senate and the House. So I'd say there's some more activity on the left in the Democratic Party, but it's still a party that manages to agree. The Bernie Sanders and Joe Manchins come together on about 75% of the business before the Congress. There is a range of views. I certainly see the Democrats being even more attentive to those left behind by economic disruptions and sort of cultural decline and physical decline, but that's not super radical or left. That's just dealing with the problems of people who are hurting in the country.
Norm Ornstein, I wanted to ask you about a quote from Mike Lofgren, a veteran Republican congressional staffer, which you cited back in 2012, explaining why he decided to end his career on the Hill after almost 30 years. The Republican Party, he wrote on truthout.org, is becoming less and less like a traditional political party in a representative democracy and becoming more like an apocalyptic cult or one of the intensely ideological authoritarian parties of 20th century Europe. That's a pretty scary change.
And for a longtime Republican who worked on the Hill, pretty telling. The apocalyptic cult part may be a little bit overdone, but an authoritarian party like many of those we see in Europe, especially with that authoritarian populism that we have seen that includes I alone can fix it, along with appeals to nativism, protectionism, and the like, is a lot of what we do see in the Republican Party right now. There are some people outside the process, especially some Republicans like Evan McMullin, for example, who ran as an independent for president but had been a long-time conservative Republican staffer, David Frum, the policy intellectual, and others, trying to work against this, trying to make it back into a problem-solving, more traditionally conservative party. But right now, they're on the outside looking in. And what Lofgren said, which is before Trump, before Cruz emerged as the potential rival to Trump, is pretty telling.
And Tom, do we see a realignment of the parties, on the scale of what happened after the Civil Rights Bill?
It's not clear yet. I don't see any unraveling of the Democratic coalition right now. There is a question of the future of the Republican Party. Remember, it was the Republican Party that was created in the lead up to the Civil War with the resentments toward immigration, conflict over slavery, the Know Nothing Party, which arose and then declined, and Lincoln rode that wave and developed it more powerfully to become perhaps the country's greatest president, and that party has quite a record over time, but it is under great stress, as we have said. It's radicalized. It really wants to undo the mixed economy in which government is there both to supplement and to check the activities of the market system and to provide the public goods that would not be provided in a Ayn Rand world. So they're teetering on potential division or collapse. The bottom line is, and Norma and I feel very strongly about this, our political system doesn't work well with only one governing party. We need two governing parties, one left, one right. They have to have the capacity to accept the legitimacy of the other. They have to believe in truth, in facts, evidence, and science. They have to be willing to compromise. They can have big differences to begin with, but they've got to be credible, and they have to be accountable, and they have to accept the logic of our Madisonian system of government. Right now, the Republican Party is checked out of that. We made a strong case for that in our book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks. And now we're about to update and renew that argument in a book in which E.J. Dionne is joining the two of us, called One Nation After Trump.
Gentlemen, thank you very much, and good luck with the new book.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Neal. Bye-bye.
The executive producer of Truth, Politics, and Power is Sue Goodwin. The editor, John Agulnik. The managing producer is Arjun Hutchins. And Jan Andrews manages our digital content. Our theme was composed and performed by the Redwater Trio. You can listen to this program and to previous editions of the show on our website, truthpoliticsandpower.org. You can also find us on Facebook, iTunes, and TuneIn. Thanks for listening. I'm Neal Conan.
Truth, Politics, and Power is produced by Kohala Mountain Radio, with support from James T. Posner and from Paul and Marcia Ginsberg. The program is distributed by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange.